Patrick Conlon and I used to be in politics and do some of this stuff, and so I have a perspective, so explain that. What I think is pretty obvious in Australia at a federal level is that the politics of infrastructure has become far more polemical. There is the area of consensus has shrunk, and so I see there is a very important role for disinterested academia to try and build a better consensus around these things. But the question I'd have to ask you, having studied once myself, is how do you do that? Do you reward the people that work in your roles for their academic outcomes, or for the fact that their influence or academic viewpoint has influenced a policymaker or has influenced an infrastructure outcome? So how do you make that balance? How do you achieve that? Because I do know that, when I studied law, the last thing you wanted in an honours thesis was something that someone would implement.
Yes, right.
So, interesting actually, we were, I probably have to be anonymous about it, we're talking to a Deputy Vice-Chancellor of a local university earlier today about what are the measures of impact that universities are now evaluated against with regard to the money that's put into them, wherever that money might come from. And one of the ones which is sadly neglected, and it's one of the reasons we've created this new department, which the three of us are all part of, called Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy, is to address the fact we don't have enough impact on policy at a range of scales. So the first thing to say is, in the UK at least, we're now changing the game, and UCL is in the lead in changing the game with regard to the money and the knowledge capital that's created in universities having an impact on policy is now part of the metrics. So people will be rewarded for having an impact on policy frameworks, for generating discourse about policy outcomes, and hence by impacting politicians. First thing to say. Second thing to say is I think most cities in Europe are now beginning to realise, and I'm sure it's true here, is that cities are now beginning to value the knowledge system that their universities that exist within their city boundaries give them. That is actually part of the infrastructure. The knowledge system in a city that is created by the bodies of academic work that is in those universities is an asset for that city. And those city leaders really should know that. Boris certainly knows that in London. He has an infrastructure plan for London, which is out for consultation. If anyone's interested, go and look at the Greater London Authority website, and you'll find an infrastructure plan until 2050 for London. It's a horrendously large amount of money. He won't get anywhere near it, but at least he's put something on the map that says these are the sorts of things we need to do. Now, he's involved the universities of London in creating that document, and I had the privilege of leading what they call the city thinkers. That was a rather teasing remark by the GLA. In getting a body of people together from a range of different universities who normally would compete over research grants to collaborate over advising London on what should be their infrastructure issues. When he starts shelling out money, no doubt we'll start competing for that money. But initially we're collaborating to determine what the landscape should be. And that was my point at the end about the mixture of collaboration and competition. There's certain phases in the thinking about infrastructure where it is necessary to collaborate. There's certain phases where it's necessary to compete. And if one takes a system of systems view about that sort of set of interconnected wicked problems, I think we could get in better shape. And that, of course, is part of the academic role of helping governance bodies, whether it's a city leadership group or a national or a state leadership group, understand that landscape on a bigger canvas than they would normally think about it. At least help them try and do that. May not always succeed, but that's the journey we're on. Does that help?
Yes. Well.
Good.
I think that given the complexities of the modern world and the types of issues that we're facing along with climate change, the need to move to some kind of interdisciplinary basis for our knowledge sharing and decision making is inevitable, and I think that universities, along with governments, are well placed to take the lead in those areas. So, Arthur, what do you think about that in terms of planning for climate change? Have you seen a shift towards interdisciplinary cooperation?
Well, in connection to answering your question, I'll start there and get to the climate change as an example. I think we are very, very far off from making academia really impactful. And of course, there is this, in different countries, the ministries that fund the science that they want to attach an impact agenda to that and want to evaluate also to which extent universities have impact. The best example of that I have seen was, I heard just recently, is the one in Ireland, where if you go to the Science Council and you want to get funding, then they do with international reviewers, Ireland's a small country, they want to determine this excellent research. Okay, fine. But then there's an impact panel with no scientists, no academics in it. So it's people from industry, from government, from all kinds of national labs, etc. And they assess for proposals, so we're talking about research here, how impactful it can really be. And I think they are very, they can be pretty reliable in terms of making those types of decisions. That's one. The other one is, of course, what kind of activities can you organize, not necessarily at the research front, but at the assessment front, and bringing knowledge together, being a broker of what do different scientists say. I have had the pleasure and displeasure of being the Dutch government delegate to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Very interesting. I won't dwell on it now. But in essence, it is a hybrid. It's a combination of academics who spend their free time, they don't get paid, working in teams and trying to make a disinterested assessment of what's out there in terms of the science and what do we know, what do we not know. And then there's the political ball game of all the different governments sitting in the same room and negotiating word by word this summary for policymakers. An interesting thing about this process, it actually works in the sense that all the different interests in the room of different countries, they are cancelled out. And there is a veto right of all these voluntary authors on any changes that are made. So in the end, after this fight, we're all very, very, very tired after 5 days of going through 20 pages word by word. All the authors I asked, what do you think of this final document? They say, well, it's clearer than we wrote before, and it's still accurate. So I think these types of processes, although there's huge fuzz and discussion on the IPCC and how political it is and how you should spin it, there's two things. There is the thing of giving you the science basis and the information. The other thing is being an advocate for a particular policy position, which the IPCC is not. Some people say IPCC says Kyoto Protocol is good. They never said that. So that's difficult, but there are some examples of where it's happening. But it's both at the science of funding, of the science, of the research, whether it has an impact. And then you have to create these niches and organizations at different levels. It was an example at the international level, but you can do the same, I think, also at local levels and have universities collaborate and have incentives to do assessment, which is different from doing primary research.
So Ian, when you gave your introductory comments, you mentioned about returning to greenfields development. I'm just wondering what the panel thinks. Is there fundamental difference between the role for public sector infrastructure investment when you're looking at greenfields as opposed to a brownfields development?
I think you were asking the rest of the panel.
Yeah. So, Michele, in terms of your work, I mean, you're focused mainly on cities, and no doubt you've been focusing perhaps more on ageing infrastructure that's well established. I know that in South Australia we're going to come up against issues of stormwater management in the metropolitan area, and that seems to pose quite fundamental different issues to a greenfield site such as the Eyre Peninsula.
Yeah, I think the challenging part, and I suppose that this actually does speak back in a sense to your question to what they were talking about, is that you really need to get to the appreciation of the variety of that sort of infrastructure, and that you have to cope with those things. It's not just a shift between green and brown or between a type of infrastructure and another. You actually have coexistence of those two things at the very same time. So at one point you're building some form of new infrastructure while you still have to manage the old type. And the transition itself is not just a one-way street. And the reason why I'm saying I think it does speak a bit back to what Brian and Arthur were saying in response to your question, is that oftentimes then the role of sort of the research institutions, not just universities, seem to be very much that of flagging the issue or telling you that that's not quite working, or here's my new little neat report that tells you that that's a bad idea, or that transition is just too superficial, you haven't taken this into account. One of the things that we're trying to do in London, and it's comforting to see some similar things around in Australia and abroad, is that you absolutely need the researcher at the beginning of the process. You absolutely need the researcher in the university to be able to not just promote an idea or tell you that that transition is wrong or it's not working. You need the researcher to write the question in the first place with the City Council. You need the researcher to write the question in the first place with a body like UN Habitat. Partly because the absorption time, the idea of impact, always takes so much and so much is lost in that translation. And partly because you need to integrate much better so that the sort of knowledge systems that Brian's talking about into the planning and into those sort of transitions. And partly, and I mean, that's more my pitch, but in a sense, partly because you absolutely need your local researchers, and you do have quite a few excellent universities. It's a pitch for UCL Australia, but it is a pitch for a number of universities in Adelaide. You have excellent researchers that can ask the hard questions that you're not going to be able to raise in a city council, but you should still take into account. And if you take green to brown transition, but if you take any sort of infrastructural assessment, oftentimes you shy away by pretty harsh social implications because you need to put the business case forward. But you still need the researcher there to remind you that it has a social impact, that a transition from green to brown is not a transition in two colors, it's a transition to societal modes, it's a transition in cultural habits. It's a political transition here in Australia.
Thanks, Michele. Brian?
Yeah, I'd like to take a slightly different slant. And one of the things we constructed in this International Centre for Infrastructure Futures was a very multidisciplinary team of researchers from business schools, economists, financial analysts, engineers, infrastructure specialists, sociologists, psychologists. And the reason for that was so that we could get a disciplinary view on these issues and do what we say others should do, which is to put it all in one place and sit around the table as sort of conveners of ourselves and discuss what the impact is. Because as you rightly say, particularly in a brownfield site, the outcomes affect all of those people or their proxy for those people. And what we're finding is if you're not innovative about, in particular, if you're not innovative about the business model and think about who is going to benefit from the investment, because quite often the person who puts up the money isn't the person who benefits. That's one of the major dislocations. And that's because we're not thinking broadly enough about the capital investment. We only think about financial capital investment. We don't think about social, political, and environmental capital investment. And we also don't think about the business model in terms of the revenue streams that might come to other parties if they were to put money into a lower risk activity up front because everyone is sitting around the table. And we've done this. We did it in the Olympics, very special case, because it's a very circumscribed entity. But the one that we're using is a very large transport project called Crossrail, which goes right underneath London. It's a £15 billion programme. It's one of the largest programmes in Europe at the moment. And as you can imagine, because it's carrying, typically they're going to tip out about 125,000 passengers at one of 4 terminals over a period of 90 minutes at peak hours, because London's a big city and a lot of people travel in and out. And so when they were constructing the idea of those 4 stations, they said, well, those 125,000 people aren't just going to want to travel, they're going to want to do other things like spend money in wine bars and shopping and restaurants, and some of them will be tourists, so we'll put them in hotels, and some of them might actually work in the same place. So we said to the property developers, put your money up front for what you will build in and around the termini, which was a lot of money, put it up front, help us do the development, then you will get the revenue afterwards. If you don't put it up front, it won't happen, you won't get the revenue. And we convinced a whole bunch of developers that was a business case. On a scale of 15 billion, everyone bought it. Some of them are Australian banks. And that has changed the business model thinking in Europe because we did it. Everyone is now beginning to see that if you think big enough and think broadly enough about the mixture of benefits across a range of dimensions of benefit, and you do it early enough, you can transform the way in which people think about the difference between brownfield and greenfield. Greenfield's a lot easier because you don't have a lot of preemptive impact. But in cities in particular, this sort of idea, I think, is worthy of examination on whatever scale works for you. I hope that's helpful. And it is becoming documented, that business model transformation.
Are there any other questions from our audience? Yeah, a minute.
So Manik Mia, Petersen, head of the infrastructure department there, nothing as lofty as what you guys have espoused. But collaboration, I believe, just like in society, Facebook, Twitter, what have you, is key to moving forward in terms of generating ideas and in terms of advancing society. I get that. You talk about big ideas, think big and you'll achieve big, and I believe that too. But how do we bring along the people that we currently are working with, whether it be within the community, so working, having contact with, people we work with within our own organisation, people we work with just in the business industry, the KPMG or the PwC. How do you get people to actually buy into that beyond the utopian dream? Because there are people that you need to bring along the journey. I bought into it, but it's pretty lonely, on the train.
So shall I answer that? One of the things, obviously, that I need to be sure we have is what I asserted to be true is actually well grounded in the case material when we can get it. So I mentioned Olympics. We're doing a lot of post-Olympic review because most people think actually the Olympics was a good event. But when you look at what went on 4 years up to it, and Sir John Armitt, who ran that programme, was very innovative in his thinking about his business models in exactly the way you've just described, because he had, I can't remember how many contractors, 30 odd principal contractors doing different things. First thing is they all sat around the table together, sort of once a week, so none of them were felt to be an isolated part from the big picture. And actually the metaphor I use is you could sort of imagine you've got a jigsaw puzzle the size of the floor of this room, and someone will be responsible for doing a bit of it, but there will be the picture of what is on the lid, on the wall. So everyone will know what everyone else is attempting to do, and they'll know how their bit joins with everyone else's bit. I mean, I know the metaphor doesn't extend too clearly, but that's the sort of principle that you hang on to the big picture, you give teams the responsibility for doing their bit of it, but you keep on reinforcing the value of them doing their bit properly to the big picture by them meeting with everyone else and learning from each other as to what works best. We're doing a number of post-implementation reviews on other aspects. We've done Terminal 5 at Heathrow. We've just done Terminal 2, which has just opened, because Terminal 5, as you're probably aware, had a glitch. And so we wanted to be really sure that Terminal 2 didn't have another sort of glitch that we hadn't spotted. We knew we weren't going to make the glitch of baggage handling, which was what went wrong on Terminal 5, because no one trained the baggage handlers. It was a very interesting little study, if I may, because everything else in Terminal 5 worked perfectly, but no one trained the baggage handlers on the new systems for handling baggage. And of course, most of us who travel on aircraft know that that is the thing you want to get right when you get off the plane. You want your bag within seconds, please. Why is it taking so long? Well, that's what they got wrong, because they didn't train the people. They didn't think of the systems that which were the expertise of the people who handled baggage, what they actually had to do. So we weren't going to make that mistake. So we're doing a number of post-implementation reviews of big programs to see exactly what we can learn about the thing you've just described, which is how do you get all the parties to, as it were, sing the same song, but different parts. Actually, the metaphor I use is a symphony orchestra. You've got a conductor, you've got a composer, but how do you make sure that everyone actually plays in harmony to the same speed and listens to each other? And you need management mechanisms for doing that. And most of the project management doctrine doesn't have those mechanisms in it. It has project managements, and it doesn't have inter-project mechanisms unless they call it program management. And program management's become its sort of own metaphor for how you do things. There's one of my colleagues, Andy Davis, who's a professor at UCL, has written a book called The Management of Projects, which is not the same thing as program management, and it's not the same thing as project management. It's the management of assemblages of projects which make up the thing you're trying to deliver. So I'll advertise his book. It's on Amazon, and he can pay me the commission. But we're very well aware of the issue you've just described. We're working at what are the mechanisms by which different communities, different cultures handle those things. Interesting talking in Singapore, very different approach to exactly the thing you've just described because of the way their governance regimes work. And one of the things I'm very interested, again, to repeat why I'm delighted to be here, is to hear from you. What are your experiences, not necessarily today, but in due course, because that's why UCL's here, right?
Michele, do you have some comments?
Just a very quick note on that would be, it sounds like a bit of a broken record, but you can learn very, very well about thinking big but practically by looking at strategic urban plans, for example, where the people where you have a little less especially in very good ones, like in Australia, certainly Sydney, for example, with Sydney 2030, the people that are planning do live in these places. It is a bit of fictional separation between the person that thinks big and plans and develops these massive ideas of infrastructure. Well, chaps in Canberra, as much as the people in Adelaide and in Sydney, do live in that infrastructure. And it shouldn't be too hard to get people to buy in or to feel relevant to that infrastructure, simply because they themselves are part of that infrastructure and they themselves are using that infrastructure. Brian's right, Singapore is phenomenal at this. Singaporeans are very good at knowing that they live within that sort of structures. At that level, at the city level, you see very good examples. Another good example from Sydney is the Open Sydney plan for Sydney at night. And it sounds a pretty trivial thing, but actually the way infrastructure is used and the way the city operates at night is fairly different from the day. Presenting that with the conscience that you live in that place, that you used to walk through a fairly seedy place like King's Cross or an acceptable place like Surrey Hills. If you are from there, you can present it as relevant. And you can present absolutely outlandish ideas, even thinking very, very big. A phenomenal example of that is Calgary and the idea that they're planning for 100 years. No more of this insert city 2030. No more of Adelaide 2015 and Sydney 2030 and London 2050. Let's do Calgary 2100. You can do that and you can think big that way when you're really rooted in the community, when you can present yourself as part of the community. And you should be able to do it at the federal level here. I can say it on camera, but they're really struggling from time to time at the federal level to present themselves as relevant, as embedded in the structure. There's this idea of we're planning from above.
I do think there's an element of leadership in this, though, all the same, because, I hesitate to use, given Ronald Reagan's reaction to the word the vision thing, but there has to be some idea about how to go forward. And if you do have a good, a decent vision about how to go forward, people will, with decent leadership, buy into it. Just take it as a trivial example. It's totally trivial, but it is a good example. Pay toll roads in Adelaide or South Australia. Everywhere else in the world has got toll roads now. We're in a position where we don't, for some reason we think road infrastructure development with toll roads is anathema to the common social good or whatever it is. Who knows? But you would have thought that when you see something like the collision on the Southern Expressway, and you listen to the radio and all these experts about how do you solve them, prevent this problem in the future, and you sort of think, well, 60 kilometre-hour limits and 90 kilometre-hour limits is only going to put off the inevitable till the next one. Why wouldn't you have some interchange at the bottom of that freeway which costs $30 million or $50 million or whatever it is, and make it a toll road for trucks going interstate? There seems obvious things you can do, and I'm not a road expert, but if you have a vision or an idea and introduce it with decent leadership where you can bring people behind you or with you, or from behind you with you, you've got a much better ability to actually make progress, to my mind.
Brian.
Yeah, could I add a comment about a player who we've not talked about before, which is the media? Because what you've just described is we could do lots of relatively small incremental things and improve things a lot. But a political announcement around something like that, the media is not interested in, and so quite a lot of our politicians aren't interested in announcing them either, because they can't cut a blue ribbon on something that is sort of 5 million here or 5 million there, so it doesn't happen. It gets subordinated into some machinery which says, actually, this isn't a worthwhile thing to do because I can't get the ministerial buy-in. So there's a threshold which the media help exacerbate because they want a good story, and a good story means something big, and that means the minister turns up. And so it's a vicious circle that takes you in the wrong direction. So there's something about delegated responsibility of those sorts of things at some level of threshold. And we used to do that. Certainly we used to do it in our country. Ministers didn't get involved in things that were below some number, which was typically sort of 100 million. Well, now they get involved in things that are like 2 million, and that stops them because sometimes they can't be bothered or they want to do it a certain way for their own particular reasons. So common sense has sort of been diluted by this interaction between macro politics and the media. And for me at least, the media should in some ways take a more pragmatic and maybe even more responsible role with regard to that issue.
It's interesting too to think about the role of the media when we do suffer extreme weather events, for example, and whether there is a degree of hindsight bias that is introduced then into our decision making around infrastructure. And I'm just wondering, has anyone got any opinion on whether reactive infrastructure is sensible in terms of moving forward, or should we always have a proactive vision for the infrastructure that we put in?
I have an opinion. Yes. Well, first of all, there's this talk about media and extreme events and also damages resulting from that. To make one thing absolutely clear, the increase that we are witnessing in terms of damages from extreme weather events is not a signal of climate change. It's just a signal of the assets value and things that are more in exposure. And the problem is that as people are grabbing on these increases in losses as a signal of climate change, that gives a huge backlash because it's not based on science. However, if we look at projections, it's very obvious that the climate signal will come in. But that's fairly long term, so you really need other drivers, such as in the Dutch case, are we safe under present climate? And then we can start doing the investments, and on top of that, we can do some reservations for the uncertain climate change coming in. And then you have a process which is not driven by a very controversial topic as such. So there's a very interesting role there for the media as well. And as the government is announcing it now, it's also in the Netherlands much, much less than in Australia, but you don't want to talk too much about climate change. But so it's, in a way, through technocracy, it is there secretly, and the scientists are dealing with it.
So I think there is something about how we make resilience affordable in a sensible way in a mixed public-private partnership. Because resilience, when you pay for it in a private company, is going to impact negatively on the bottom line, so why would you do that? Your shareholders aren't going to thank you for that. And yet the public will expect that these things keep working. So whenever you have a power outage, you say, why don't they do something about it? How did they allow that to happen? And then if I ask you, well, who's the they you're actually suggesting should have done something about it? In our country, there's at least 35 people you could choose, 35 organisations you could choose to pick on as being responsible for the fact it didn't work, whether it's a regulator, a power company, a civil engineering constructor, a meteorologist, or whatever. So part of the difficulty of the resilience argument in infrastructure against extreme events is, again, taking an holistic view of who the players are, what the stakeholder engagement is, what the benefits are of investing in it, and what the downside risks are of losing it. Last winter we had a combination of very heavy rain and very high winds, which we very rarely get. We either get high winds or a lot of rain. We had both. Softened the soil considerably. Then we had really high winds and it tipped all the trees out because all the root systems were very fragile at that point, took out a lot of power cables. I wrote a report about 4 years ago on that issue. At least I didn't write. I chaired the academic steering committee for a report that was written that went to the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And 6 months later, there was an election. And when we have an election, everything the previous government has had by way of study material gets put in the National Archive. And it's very difficult to find as a result, unless you know it's there, which I did, but no one else did. So they've just commissioned a new study on what should we do about resilience of infrastructure to extreme weather events. And you think, actually, this is a complete waste of public money. And I dug it out and sent it to the chief scientific advisor in that department. I think they're still going ahead with the study because the minister didn't want to listen, because that one had got Labour Party written all over it, and he's a Conservative. So that's another dimension of stuff getting in the way of common sense and practical value with regard to resilience. So resilience of the knowledge base, the point of the story, is not trivial. It's resilience of the accumulated knowledge is also an important factor in helping people make political decisions. If we have a process by which it isn't resilient because we keep burying it because it's a different party that ran the study, that isn't a particularly helpful way of behaving either.
Any other questions from the floor?
Ooh. What was in the pudding? There must have been something in the pudding.
Hello, I'm Neil Brown from the Adelaide City Council, General Manager for Infrastructure. What I'm going to ask is collaboration and the role of the public servant in that with the academic groups. Should we be working collaboratively all the time, regardless of the politics?
I suppose I start from a position of saying yes unless you are politically directed not to. Then it's a political decision for you not to collaborate in the sense of providing joined-up governance at the officials level in the administration. If politicians want to interfere, and I would call it interference as an ex-civil servant, and say, no, I want this siloed, then they will take the responsibility for it being like that, not you. That's where I would start from. Joined-up government is, for me, de facto, and it's not joined up because of some political imperative. Now, I know because I've worked in national security and intelligence that sometimes there are damn good reasons for not doing that. And it is beginning to apply to critical national infrastructure in the civil sense of the word, particularly in our part of the world. I guess it is for your part of the world too. So there are some good reasons why on occasions parts of the administration shouldn't talk to other parts of the administration. But I start from a viewpoint that the de facto is you share, and it's only when there's a good business reason not to, that is politically accepted, that you don't.
Arthur?
Yeah, one of the important elements here is that you don't outsource the political decision to experts, and of course that's not what we're implying here. So I think there is I would tend to advise you to maximize interaction and collaboration and bring evidence to bear to your decisions. Yeah. But where does this maximum lie? And that's a budgetary question as well.
Also, you should, at least in my experience, there's also a tendency to think that collaboration happens from the top to the top, or you have to wait for the mayor or the councillor to tell you, well, right, now we're going to collaborate with Flinders. There is a lot in the absolute resilience that you build in multiple layers of collaboration that the folks in the waste management department or whatever you've got in Adelaide should be talking to the relevant experts. And that conversation, yes, can become politicized, has some political overtones, but it also puts experts in touch with experts. And that should happen across all layers, ideally, with pitch for literally all layers. And it should happen also collaboration with other people in the same position that you are. It's not a Boris Johnson thing, but it's a Ken Livingstone thing, that local governments already steal a bucket of stuff from each other, and it's good. It's good to steal from each other. It's good to pirate ideas from other places. That was part of the founding rationale of the Climate Leadership Group, that it's 67 global cities and it's doing phenomenal work. And it was literally, well, if we steal from each other, we might as well do it openly. That's a form of collaboration. It's a two-way conversation. You have to do it with academia as much as with other cities.
So a question down here.
Yeah, Justin Jamieson, KPMG, and question for yourself, or start with yourself, Ian, reflecting on CKI's recent investment in Investra, which is a great vote of confidence in South Australia and the company itself. Combining that with social infrastructure and looking at ways that we could actually try and encourage more foreign investment or private investment in collaboration with public investment into social infrastructure in South Australia or Australia in general, but reflecting particularly on CKI and their investment in the state.
That's a very good question, Justin. For those who don't know, Hong Kong Holdings is the largest, I think it's the largest listed company in Hong Kong, which has had an ownership interest in quite a few companies, certainly in South Australia, but across Australia. It's recently taken 100% interest in Investra as of, in fact, we changed our board on Monday. Interestingly, the guy who runs that is a guy called, CKI, the infrastructure side of it. His first investment for CKI outside of Hong Kong back in 1999 was their 20% interest in Investra. It was the first overseas investment they'd ever made, outside China, that is. And here we are 14 years later and they've taken control of the company. In the meantime, I might add, they've taking very large interest in the UK. They own Northern Gas Networks, they own Wales, Thames and Water, or whatever it is. Most probably, most importantly, or most known to everybody is the main electricity company that serves Greater London, or all of London, and Greater London, in fact, which they bought for, I think, £12 billion last 3 years ago, I think it was now. But to come back to your question, that's the sort of profile of who they are. I had dinner with the managing director last week, or earlier this week, and he made the remark, I think the capitalisation of the company is $100 billion US dollars. They've got 250,000 employees worldwide, and they operate in 55 countries. But he still comes back to his first investment in South Australia. I think Pat Conlon was the energy minister in those days. Pat, weren't you? Very near to it. And I mean, his remark about to me at dinner, and in fact to my management team, is, you know, because we've been talking about gas infrastructure and energy infrastructure, which they're heavily involved with. They own it. For those who don't know, they also own SA Power Networks in South Australia as well. But his remark to me over dinner was, well, just always, well, to the management team generally, was just remember, it's not only energy infrastructure we invest in. If you've got, you know, if you find anything in South Australia that you think could be of interest, the chances are there's somewhere else in the group that already, you know, has an interest in our business. And he gave the example, which I never knew, and I've known this guy for 12 years. He's been on our board for in the early parts of the 2005. They're the biggest turf provider in Australia, for example. They own the biggest turf provider. And I said, turf for what? You know, horse racing tracks or whatever. He says, horse racing tracks, golf courses, football grounds, you name it. They own the biggest turf. Nobody's ever heard of it. Some company up in Queensland that operates throughout South Australia. Cheetah Salts here. I think it's Cheetah Salts, am I right? Cheetah Industries, whatever it is. It's the salt farm out here they own. So I think the point here really is to keep your mind open to these things. These sorts of investors are incredibly valuable to not only the South Australian community, but generally, and they've got a very, coming back to your cultural aspect of the question, they've got a very open mind. It's not what you think of as a stereotypical, you know, Asian investment. And I hate the word Asian, I must admit, because it's so broad, but, you know, there's a stereotypical idea that you're into a narrow particular area and you're running a particular business or whatever it is. They're the complete antithesis of that. And I think as far as South Australian infrastructure generally is concerned for this country, those are the sort of investors that are incredibly valuable because they come here with a cost of capital because of the size and because of the way they do business, which is you know, far less than what you'll be able to find from local markets.
Any other comments from the panel, just in terms of impacts of the globalisation of infrastructure ownership? Michele?
I'd just add to that that's a dimension I don't hear being talked about, you know, nearly enough. So you hear about discussions of, I don't know, national building program, and you say MB2, it's 24 billion investment over these many years. That's fantastic. Let's talk about it. And there's very little understanding that this sort of stuff is embedded in even larger technical systems, like what you're talking about, equivalent discussions you could have on service provisions or utilities with creatures, not necessarily bad creatures, but creatures like Veolia and CEDA and Semcorp that really deliver most of the services. I challenge you going out and not seeing a Veolia or a CEDA garbage truck. And you'd see that in pretty much any city that I can think about. We very rarely factor that type of systems, that type of connections on the top of a national or a state discussion. While actually those systems work. That's basically one of the basic rationales. They're interconnected globally. They're not just companies, but conglomerates, groups of states that deliver this sort of things. That concerns me a bit when everything's on MB2 and discussions of the politics of MB2, where MB2 gets talked about as either a federal or a state issue. Where's the international? Where's the large technical on that?
Ryan?
There's one other thing, and Michele might like to comment on this because we were talking about it last night, is we've talked about the developed world very much in what we're talking about here, infrastructure for the developed world. We were both at an event last week in Auckland, and someone from Rwanda stood up and talked about the professional cadre of people that existed in his country, you probably wouldn't fill one table in an event like this with people who'd actually understand the conversations we've been having for the whole of the country. So a lot of the developing world is in a situation where it doesn't have the educational processes or the educated people to deliver the infrastructure that they need in order to get themselves into a position to become economically active on a world scale. And yet most of the world's population increasingly is going to be in those countries. So there's something to do with us having a moral and a commercial obligation to start thinking about how we generate that. We're doing that from an academic point of view, but those of you involved, and I'm sure a few of you will be, in philanthropic activity of the nature of that sort get that onto your radar, because I think it's quite an interesting proposition. One of the statistic I know is that in 2035, 8% of the world's population will live in Western Europe. 8. And we think, arrogantly, we're quite often the centre of the universe. We're not. And we're absolutely not going to be in 15 years' time. And you came up with a statistic about how much of the world's population is within the time zone we're in here.
It was David. And he
it was David, sorry, it was you.
How much?
18%.
18% is in this time zone.
In a half-hour time zone.
In a half-hour time zone, yeah. And that's another way of saying, where is the density of infrastructure activity in the world? It's not going to be in Western Europe, even though we are relatively mature. A lot of it's going to be here, but a lot of the need is going to be elsewhere. And that's going to be an interesting globalization conversation, a set of activities that we somehow need to understand how to fund and how to govern. Otherwise, we're going to have huge unrest and big ethical problems with dealing with the consequences.
So was there another question over there? This could be our last question, I think.
Hi, my name's James McEwen. I'm a lawyer at Wallmans. I've spent probably the last 10 or 11 years acting for local government specifically. And what I've found interesting is that local government either own or control significant infrastructure, and for years we've been talking about doing more with less, and it seems to have heading to a crunch point where a local government it doesn't control policy, and it's it's way down the chain in funding. Have we got the structure wrong? And I'm just interested in your thoughts on our system, where we've got three tiers of government, and particularly in South Australia we have a lot of councils who are doing a lot with very little and little control at a high level. Thanks.
With greatest respect to the expertise of the contractors in the room who service such local government activity, they're not the local government officials, and so the lack of expertise on even to be a buyer of the services that deliver the infrastructure in local government in our country is tragic. It's changed over the last 50 years in the wrong direction, partly through privatisation and the downsizing of the budgets of local administrations to run themselves professionally. There's an adage in the outsourcing market in IT, where I used to work extensively, that a problem that is outsourced is an outsourced problem. If you can't manage it inside, don't outsource it. And that's part of where I think we're headed, and why I agree with you, that we are headed for a crunch point. It's one of the mantra that we have in the department we've got, which is to start educating local government officials on this issue of science, technology, engineering and public policy, the whole analytics framework, how we do better, not just on infrastructure, but a whole range of different things. So I absolutely agree with you. It has been allowed to go in the wrong direction by budgetary pressures and by a perception that the market knows how to do it better than local government. Well, it knows how to do some things better than local government, but it may not know how to do certain things, and we're at a tipping point on a number of factors. That would be my take on your comment.
But I think your question, if I've got it right, is also about the balkanisation of councils as well, where you haven't got the economies of scale within individual councils to be able to effectively manage cost in a cost-competitive way, or a cost-efficient way, put it better. Look, there's no question in South Australia and Adelaide in particular, the number of councils, we should be combining the number of councils. I mean, the idea that you can't get effective political representation through a council the size of Adelaide when Brisbane's got the same size council for the entire city is just nonsense. And the cost to it for the individual, which I worry about more as just like my gas consumers, You know, they pay the price, and if you could bring the average person's bill down by, you know, I can't remember what council bills are, it depends on your house at the moment, but, you know, $1,000 or $2,000, whatever it is a year, if you could halve it, why wouldn't you? And do you think you could halve it if you actually had one council in Adelaide, or maybe two? And give it a go as a business person.
You also, sorry, if you combine their balance sheets, they've got pretty strong balance sheets.
Oh, they've got terrific assets. Yeah.
That's Auckland, and it's exactly the same conversation of Sydney. How long have we been going on and on and on the idea of Greater Sydney? And you're concerned because you're losing power, but at the same time you're balkanizing entirely, and you're replicating in very, very small. And you say 3 layers of government. How often is the last or the lowest layer of government recognized at the federal level? How often do you get recognition for actually being the one that mostly owns the infrastructure and the services? You absolutely need city regional coordination, city regional government. That's a bit that have been going on forever. And clearly not in South Australia, but in New South Wales. You absolutely need city regional government like in London, because it's a clear line of accountability, and because then not just a matter of balance sheets, but you can actually understand what you're locking yourself in. You're locking yourself into a whole bunch of mini councils that all then own a part of their infrastructure, I would say, not entirely, but who operates that infrastructure. And that's where you superimpose that political map on the business map. You say, oh, actually, waste management in places like this is operated by pretty much 3 or 4 companies. Then there's a whole bunch of subsidiaries. But you do not have the appropriate layer of government to cope with this. Auckland's done it. We've seen it last week. I've seen phenomenal things. It's hard. It's complex. But lots of other places have stepped in that direction. I'm flabbergasted by the fact that Sydney, Melbourne, pretty much anywhere in Australia, you don't have it. We don't. I can say we don't have it. And it's a good. But look at Brisbane. That could be a good example.
Unfortunately, I need to bring the discussion to an end. I'm sure we could continue with these interesting questions all afternoon. I'd like to invite David Travers to come up to the stage now to offer the vote of thanks. David.
Thank you. On behalf of University College London, I'd like to thank the panel for your time this afternoon, Ian for providing an industry and a local context to the discussion, the team from London for your time, and Carolyn for hosting us and leading us through a pretty interesting discussion. These types of events are very important, I think, because as a university it's very easy for us to sit in our little ivory tower and talk amongst ourselves. One of the things that I take away from a discussion like this is just a simple language difference. We might all be interested in infrastructure, but it's that ability to communicate, and I can see some of that even today. And so one of the things we try very hard here is to ensure that we get out and do these sorts of things, that we engage with industry, we engage with policymakers, and that we don't sit in our ivory tower. And even though we're focused at the moment in the energy and resources sector, we look forward to continuing our engagement in Adelaide and in Australia, and our industry partnerships with Santos and BHP and so on. So thanks very much to the panel again. Hamilton asked me to say, instead of giving a gift to our speakers, that CEDA donates to the Catherine House charity. So thank you.